Perfect. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Marc Ross. I am the head librarian at the Hanley and Haskell libraries at the regional campuses at the University of Pittsburgh in Titusville and Bradford. So just to situate where we are, where I am, Titusville is where I spend most of my time. Titusville is about an hour south of Erie, Lake Erie, and 2 hours north of Pittsburgh. Bradford is in central PA, right on the border of New York and Pennsylvania in the Allegheny National Forest. Jenelle could talk a little bit more about that. As the head librarian, I oversee all the collections, work with the librarians to develop information literacy sessions, work with students and student affinity groups on both campuses. Jenelle does a lot more at the Bradford campus, so we'll talk about that. And overall, kind of just do administrative type work. So Jenelle, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. I work at the Bradford Library. It's a small regional campus, as Marc mentioned. And as a liaison to equity, diversity, and inclusion, I have a variety of jobs throughout the day. Sometimes I'm teaching sessions, sometimes I'm working with students on collection development, with affinity groups like Marc mentioned. And then the educational outreach is really with the community and just incorporating and going to them and saying, how can we help you? What do you need? And also incorporating that EDI into that as well.
All right. Okay, go ahead, Jenelle.
The land acknowledgement that we want to read before we get started is from Northwestern Pennsylvania, a place I call home, and also the Pitt-Bradford campus. And it's traditional lands and also the contemporary lands of the Onondaga, Seneca Nation of the Haudenosaunee, and the Erie people. And they were removed from their lands, beginning with Session 1, which is still acknowledged by the Seneca people as an unratified treaty. They do not recognize the first one, which was October 22nd, 1784. And we continue to work with them, and we will continue to seek reconciliation for the loss of the lives and trauma from the forced assimilation, removals, violence, genocide, and occupations. We work towards individual and collective action to repair and resist erasure while uplifting their history and knowledge, experiences, and also their ways of healing. And we'll share the part of the presentation at the end, and it gives you some ways to learn about the Haudenosaunee, the Confederacy, and the Seneca Nation. There's also a great site about the Kinzua Dam and what happened from the 20s all the way up to the 60s when it was built. And then the Seneca Iroquois National Museum is located about 30 minutes north of us, and it is a beautiful, spectacular museum. So all those links will be available later on.
All right, and before we get started, we did want to, we have a extensive reference list at the end of people's works who we cite and whose voices we want to acknowledge, but there are a few special people that we wanted to acknowledge that we perhaps won't be citing their works or have influenced us in different ways. So I'll start. These are folks not affiliated with the library, but both with the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. I am currently an EDD student working on getting my doctoral diploma in education, and Dean Valerie Kinlock at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education has really influenced my personal reading and writing and my professional work that I've been doing with the library. She really focuses on literacy's place as important to students, race and urban education. She's really influenced my work on the library as a safe space, a space where students can feel that they belong. And Dr. Richard Milner, he was the previous chair of the University of Pittsburgh Center for Urban Education. He's currently the Vanderbilt Chair of Education in Department of Teaching and Learning. And similar to Dean Kinlock, he helped me really get some insight into this idea of opportunity gaps instead of achievement gaps. He coined that phrase. You know, so often in education, we think of achievement gaps, you know, deficit thinking, students that aren't achieving. He kind of flipped it and turned it into opportunity gaps and pointed out spaces where students weren't given the opportunity to thrive. And that's really helped influence some of my reading, writing, and research.
And the people I picked are people who I think are not on a lot of people's radar because of the current conditions, and we're fighting the anti-racist white supremacist system. So I want to call Dr. Scott. She is a professor of writing and composition at the main campus. She gave an amazing talk just a couple of weeks ago on the use of hip hop in teaching, and she was the first Black woman to be a tenure track position at the University of Pittsburgh within the school of the Dietrich School. So I really want to give her a call out because there's only 3% of our faculty at Pittsburgh are Black women. And then Atina Fareed Cook, she has transformed the way I think. She is a photographer and an artist, and she works with Cornell University, which I'm going through a certificate right now for equitable community change. And she actually has quite a few shows in the Buffalo area. Recognizing why we need to present on this topic. There's no such thing as a neutral education process. If you went to the CRT session before this one, they were talking about this, that there's no such thing as neutral. We are in a white supremacist system and structure, and we need to call that out. And avoidance has consequences. As Dr. Gay stated, there's too many students of color who have not been achieving. And we're not just talking about like test scores, we're talking about true life achievement. And it's been happening far too long. And we have to insist this disempowerment stops right now, and that we are setting in motion change. And then we also want to think about approaching this from the funds of knowledge and a strength-based teaching with critical awareness, and then placing them at promise instead of risk. And so in other words, like an abolitionist style, demythologizing reality of this white supremacist system.
Okay, so the learning objectives that we want the participants to leave with and then bring with them either, you know, into their classrooms as they do library instruction and hopefully work with pre-service teacher. We came up with a few. So we want participants to gain a basic understanding of culturally responsive, anti-racist pedagogies and equity frameworks. We chose to focus on historically responsive literacy and some of the other frameworks that follow along with that, and its importance for pre-service teachers. Be able to apply critical literacy dimensions and anti-racist pedagogy when creating information literacy instruction for pre-service teachers. Recognize and confront their biases. When I say their, I mean the instruction librarians and those that might do collection development and create instruction sessions. Have them, you know, recognize their own biases. And then, you know, follow-up work when analyzing their library's teaching curriculum, or, you know, the instruction sessions they've done in the past, and then analyzing their current collection. We're hoping that the librarian will utilize equity and anti-racist pedagogical frameworks, such as historically responsive literacies. So that's what we hope we walk away with. You know, building on top of what Jenelle mentioned about recognizing why we need to present on this topic, some of the questions that helped guide us as we were thinking about how to put this presentation together were loaded questions that came from a Kieran Heffernan article a couple years ago in an ACRL post. Heffernan did a commentary on the ACRL framework and looked specifically at and examined the framework through DEI glasses. And what jumped out at us were some of the questions, loaded questions surrounding authority as constructed in contextual and scholarship as conversation, and how we use those two frames in particular a lot when we think about historically responsive literacies, culturally relevant pedagogy, things like that. So we tweaked Heffernan's list a little bit and came up with our own ideas, and added a few other questions. So the questions that we thought were important were: what establishes authority on a topic? Have we included experience or perspectives in this evaluation? The ACRL framework does call out that there are different perspectives, and calls out, that the experience matters whenever we think about authority, but perhaps it doesn't go far enough, and we'll talk about that in each one of these questions. Sorry, I lost my notes as I was talking. Has the authority of this perspective or experience been elevated through privilege? So when we were thinking about this question, in the knowledge practice of the frame itself, they talk about subject expertise, societal position, or special experiences. And the examples they give are scholarship, scholarship, and as Jenelle mentioned, whenever we think of scholarship, we might think of tenured faculty that are writing and publishing on a specific topic, but that is so heavily influenced by white upper class males, very few marginalized voices. Societal positions, so the example the ACRL framework gives is public officer title, again highly the diversity isn't there, it's mostly white males. And then special experience, participating in a historic event. When we think about participating in a historic event and how a voice might be elevated, we do think about who is writing about that special historic event. It's probably white upper class male in a in academia. What bias might be brought with the author? What does this reinforce? Again, as we're thinking about these things, it's the bias is probably coming from the status quo. What voices go unheard or are excluded because of a lack of privilege? So again, the voices that get pushed aside. What did Jenelle say? 3% of faculty at the University of Pittsburgh are Black women. So these are voices that get pushed aside, and perhaps the white male gatekeep that scholarship from being entered into the record. And then finally, does the authority is constructed in contextual go far enough in addressing power and privilege? I thought of this, I was reading it, I was kind of trying to deconstruct it a little bit. The frame does call out the need to acknowledge that biases and privilege exist, especially in terms of worldview, gender, sexual orientation, and cultural orientation. But it doesn't necessarily, reading that, it doesn't specify race, class, or ability. I think if we really wanted to question or acknowledge biases in these things, in privilege of authority, they perhaps could have gone a little bit further and specified these things. So again, when we were thinking about a framework with which to present this topic, we, I think, went to critical literacy, critical information literacy, critical librarianship, but working specifically with pre-service teachers, wanted to find a framework that works specifically for pre-service teachers. Jenelle stumbled on this book. I shouldn't say stumbled on it. She found this book and suggested I read it. It's a very quick read, a very good read. Goldie Muhammad's Cultivating Genius, an Equity Framework for Culturally and Historically Responsive Literacy. What Muhammad does is provide a framework and a model, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides, that really helps guide teachers. And she specifically calls out pre-service teachers using this book to begin thinking about equity-based pedagogy while they're selecting information and resources for their classroom, planning interdisciplinary units and lessons, and ways to engage students that cultivate genius. And as we're reading this, we can think, or as we read this, we thought about ways that we could incorporate this into our library instruction, specifically for pre-service teachers, as Jenelle will model a little bit later, but also just as we're working with students in general. So yeah, librarians working with pre-service teachers have a unique opportunity to introduce this work and model it in their own lessons. Research has shown that pre-service teachers are often don't necessarily have a relationship with liaison librarians or instruction librarians. Sometimes their class work is so structured and regimented that it's difficult for a librarian to work with pre-service teachers. So if we can get into the classroom with them, as Jenelle will demonstrate a little bit later, we have an opportunity that's unique to help push these this framework and suggest this framework as a tool to use. So what is culturally and historically responsive literacy? So again, Guldi Muhammad, she kind of took the idea of culturally responsive pedagogy and kind of put it historically responsive pedagogy under the umbrella of the overall culturally responsive and culturally relevant pedagogies. It aligns with, like I say here, aligns with culturally relevant and culturally responsive models, as well as funds of knowledge. So when we talk about funds of knowledge, we talk about gathering, students outside the classroom, expertise that they bring with them, the things that the lived experience that they have as they come into the classroom. Cultural modeling, understanding how students might behave in the classroom, understanding again the culture, the different cultures that they bring with them into the classroom, and then a little bit different culturally sustaining pedagogy. So culturally relevant and culturally responsive kind of help demonstrate the need to acknowledge the differences and acknowledge cultures that are different from the dominant. Culturally sustaining actively sustains, perpetuates, uplifts those marginalized communities. So with historically responsive, her historically responsive framework kind of brings all these together. And as mentioned, she really creates a model. So it's not just a theory, it's a model that teachers can use and pre-service teachers can use as they're going through the program, looking at critical theory, sociocultural theory, and cognitive theories. And finally, what Muhammad does is really brings into the history, and that's where the historically comes in, ways that literacy was conceptualized and practiced in Black literary societies throughout the 19th century. So literacy in Black communities as, ways to, fight the oppressors, as freedom, as emancipation, things like that, through reading, through forming their own literary groups. She really draws on that, and celebrating Black history and celebrating Black students. So just a little bit more about culturally relevant and responsive. So Ladson Billings really wrote the seminal work about culturally relevant education. What Ladson Billings wrote about is really centering education on care, love, and respect. All of these things really helps empower students by utilizing knowledge about their unique and diverse cultures. So by centering on care, love, and respect, we're kind of removing authority from the classroom. We're giving some authority back to the students to also model care, love, and respect for each other and for their teacher. Culturally responsive, similarly, removes authority from the classroom by acknowledging different, histories, identities, and literacies as assets to instruction to increase authentic motivation for learning by connecting to their lived experiences. So very similar, acknowledging, recognizing, and using lived experiences to help promote education, rather than just the authoritative teacher in the front of the classroom. Gay wrote culturally responsive teaching, broke it down to 6 or 7 really good bullet points. I won't define them all, but validating, comprehensive and inclusive, multidimensional, empowering, transformative, emancipatory, and humanistic, normative, and ethical. And Muhammad calls out in her book that it's kind of sad that we have to specify that education should have a humanistic approach, that it's normative and that it's ethical. that all of these things should just come natural to teachers that want to help cultivate genius with their students. Go ahead, Jenelle.
So the culturally relevant and responsive is anti-racist. And if you're not incorporating an anti-racist practice, you're not doing it right. And a lot of people don't realize this. A lot of people think it's celebrating cultures, but it's much, much more than that. And it's a way to use. So by using this, you allow yourself to use enabling text. And that's moves the text beyond just that skill-based, and it really gets them to think critically about the world and their experiences in it. And it also recognizes and understands and critiques the current social inequities. And so it encourages students to look critically at the world and become change agents. And they're committed to promoting greater equity and equality, justice, and power balances. And it also lifts the veil of presumed absolute authority from this scholarly concept, and makes students realize that there's really no single version of the truth, and its truth is not totally permanent. And so it really gets students to open up and think differently, and to engage in ways that they might not with other ideas. And it also develops the necessity for cooperation and community, so that collective connectedness and being accountable for one another's success. So it's quite different from the dominant ways of teaching in a white supremacist system. So teachers, to start, so as a librarian, as a teacher, I taught in public education for 14 years before I became a librarian at Pitt-Bradford. And so I have so many years of applying this, and I thought, how do you put 12 years of what you've done, 12, 14 years of what you've done, and then of course what you've done in what you've done in the library as well. And so I really had to think about what I could give you, so you can go and you can take this and replicate it or make it your own. So teachers really need to, librarians, teachers really need to be able to reach back into students' histories. They have to deeply know to teach in ways that raise, grow, and develop those students and their existing genius. So their genius is there. And we just have to capitalize, we just have to work in ways that acknowledges that not everyone learns the same way, and not everyone is going to show what they know in the same way. And so Muhammad also explains approaches for learning how to authentically engage with students' language and the multiple and diverse literacies. And so really, we're going to go over a few of them in this presentation, but to get the full experience, the book would be extremely helpful. And she does that through the 5 pursuits or what she calls learning goals. And the first is identity, meaning making, and that's understanding the self within the local and broader context. And you use that funds of knowledge again, and to inform their actions and make sure that they're not just in this silo. And then literacy is the competence, the ability, the expertise, but also to use that type of knowledge to make informed decisions. And intellect is to do something with that knowledge. So you take that knowledge, you also take the history along with it. So it historizes that knowledge and it helps you make decisions. It also helps people overcome oppressors and resist the marginalization that the system creates. And criticality is all about detecting or recognizing that misrepresentation, the oppression, the oppressors, and being able to challenge that and feel confident in saying this white supremacist system is not, even though it's normal, it shouldn't be normal. And the last one is joy, and she added this as she was working. If you study her work, she added it throughout, and joy is really to celebrate and that love, respect, the care, and that bringing that humanizing approach back into education. So when we talk about designing culturally relevant and historically relevant information literacy lessons, I'm taking my approach from being a teacher and from being a librarian. So the agenda is, and I have to admit, although our campus is quite diverse racially, I believe 2 years ago it was 20%, and I think we dipped a little bit to 15% African American Black students. I still, in my teaching, had predominantly white students, and I still have predominantly white classrooms with the teachers. And so when I approach this, I'm approaching it as a white woman, and I have to remember that it's not going to be the same for everyone else. And so this is my approach, and I hope it'll help you and that you can take it and adapt it to the ways that work for you. So we review when I go in. This is a 2.5-hour session. I was so fortunate to have the professor that I worked with give me 2.5 hours to work with the students for an entire evening, actually. And so they already come in, they know about culturally relevant and responsive teaching. They don't know about ACRL. And so I introduce them to see how they connect. I show them. And that's very brief. That doesn't take long at all in my presentation. And then we begin to examine and unpack the meaning of bias and how it shows up in our teaching. Sometimes this is new for students, but Pitt-Bradford has lately been, and Pitt as general, has been requiring racial consciousness courses for students. So they have that idea often when they step in the classroom about bias. And then we explain the importance of planning units and lessons, knowing your students, the use of enabling text, and discussion of authority. And then I take the students to, once we have this discussion, I take them to the CRC, that's the Curriculum Resource Center. And we talk about, let's find some books that challenge the dominant narrative that we were just talking about. And students return and they share and explain how their selections challenge that dominant narrative that they may have heard before, but now they're actually themselves challenging it. And so in the final thing that was amazing about this session was I had time to help teachers prepare, at least give them resources to prepare for those difficult topics or the complex topics, and give them appropriate background information in the teaching context. So it's not just challenging these, but you have to be prepared. You have to know the background, and it's really widely unprofessional to go in and not know how to talk about race, cultures, and diverse perspectives. So step one, going into a little bit more detail. As a librarian, as a teacher, we first have to unpack those bias. And we have to also think about our own histories, our own beliefs. How do our identities show up when we're teaching, when we're selecting material? For example, like going to that book where, you know, the one that we always love so much, but is it really connecting with our students, or is it really just about how I feel about this book? And then Muhammad provides help for teachers and librarians with this, with the bias. So in her HRL framework and the model, she gives a lot of details about how you can reflect, how you can examine, such as what are your own ideologies and beliefs? How is the literacy defined in your classroom? And that goes back to the framework. How do we define literacy? What is authority? And what skills do we really focus on? What do I think as a teacher or librarian shows that someone knows something that I might be completely forgetting or ignoring other ways of knowledge which they can show us what they know? And of course, I feel that it would be wildly irresponsible just to say Muhammad has all the answers, because there's so much out there. And in the work of examining your own bias, and it never stops. So I've given some resources, and again, we'll share a brief version of the PowerPoint so that you have all these. But these are some of the great examples. I love listening to podcasts, so I include the Air We Breathe from Hidden Brain is just one of many podcasts. The intersectionality wheel based off of Crenshaw's work. Duckworth takes that and shows it in illustration. And so people learn in different ways, so I tried to provide a couple different of each way of learning. And then the Equity Center Planning Guide is one that I really want to bring attention to. I was in a class this winter, and the Due East Educational Equity Collaborative, they provided this for those, and it's actually free. So on the next slide, I'm just giving you a brief example of what this graphic organizer would look like, so that if you've never done this as a teacher or a librarian, you can really sit, and it's not like you have to do this for every lesson. I found that once I started understanding my bias, I was better at picking things out the further I went along. But this graphic organizer, as you can see, goes over from standards, which that's a whole nother presentation in itself with the Common Core, but learning targets, maybe such as like, what are you traditionally centering and who are you leaving out? What misrepresentations are being brought up in that book you're selecting? Who's the authority, and do they really know about that experience? And knowledge of the students, once again, bringing that in so you can see how these align nicely. How does this unit or lesson validate our students? And so bringing students to the CRC after I help them examine their own bias, how I help them go over the culturally relevant teaching, calling out the white supremacist system, and then we go to selection. And our CRC, we're really fortunate. We have a nice area where we have K through 12 literature, textbooks, we have nonfiction, puppets, all kinds of really awesome things for our pre-service teachers to check out, kits that they can use. And so not only is it cool in that way, but there are so many ways that we can challenge this white supremacist system and really give this a chance, this resource center, to be a way that we can critically examine and also an anti-racist approach. I provided a couple of, for students, it's overwhelming, right? 2.5-hour session, we go over things, they walk around, they bring things back, we talk about it. And so I not only did I provide the presentation for them, but I also created 2 resource guides, the LibGuides, we call them. And one of it was just a page on our CRC, and it's just about picture books. And the other one, and using this approach with picture books, and then the diversity, equity, and inclusion resource guide that I created for the Bradford campus. So going back to that, when we're looking with students and we're talking and that knowledge of knowing your students, having that identity, excuse me, I go back, we're in the CRC right now, and I say, okay, we're going to start with the students. I really want to think about who are your students. And I know sometimes that can be hard with pre-service teachers, but a lot of them do have lab experience. And so they can imagine, or themselves sitting in the classroom, and what didn't my teacher or teachers provide for me. And so I use a lot of different things for them to help build that identity of who are your students. I provide some ideas with surveys, not just like what's your favorite color survey, like really deep surveys that I use that help me inform how do you learn best? Do you like group work? If you had to read, what would you select? Those kind of things. And then Muhammad also provides a short essay example. And again, there's so many other things, such as Roberts has identity lessons as well. So there's so many things out there for you to learn more about your students. And I know that's hard as a librarian, but we really want to put that into practice with our pre-service teachers. We want to say you need to know your students. You need to be able to, see their worldview and not just yours. And so that always brings me to The Mirrors, Windows, and Glass Doors by Bishop. And this is where I really see the connection with students. When I show this, I give them a couple examples of books. And whether it's I'm teaching the secondary education students or whether I'm working with elementary students, we really talk about who is seen, who's heard in that book, who is telling the story, who is represented by whom, who are they being represented by, or who or what is left out, and what's really seen as valid. Like, is this the bully perspective, or are we talking about someone who's actually gone through this, such as in Starfish with the character, she with body size, and she realizes that she is beautiful the way she is, and it's such an empowering story. It's not going from a sense of trauma or a lack of, and it's really beautiful. So I try to show students that you can have these approaches. And I do the same thing with the picture books. I try to center the feeling of celebration, joy, love, all the way to the top. With the disabilities, we have hair love. So these are all these beautiful picture books that I bring out and I set out and try to help the students not feel so scared to pull those books off the shelf and really, and I always say, take them all off. We don't care. We'll put them back. There's so many great books here. And I think this is a chance where so many have said, I would have never ever, I would have been afraid to just start pulling stuff and leaving through stuff and questioning who's the writer, who's the author. And so this is really a good chance for them in the CRC. And just to give a quick help, this is what I provide for the students. I give them the Novel Mind database. That is amazing. I can't say enough about that database. And I'll show you here in the next slide a picture of it, but a screenshot of it. And the disrupt text, so following on Instagram, on Twitter, listening to podcasts, I try to tell them there's not just one way for you to figure out these stories of challenging authority. And I always say we've got to allow the theory of change. So the theory of change is based off of what we want things to look like, what we want it to be. So that idea of abolition, not the destruction, but the dreaming, the planning, the organizing of what should be. And then, of course, I always remind them, you still got to make sure that the students can read it. It might be a wonderful book, but it also might be too difficult for them. So I do go over things like Lexile levels, common media sense, just touch up briefly, because I know they're learning that, but I do want to remind them of that.
All right, and then tying this back into the historically responsive literacies and culturally relevant and culturally responsive pedagogy and authority and scholarship as conversation. So we'll talk a little bit about that. How do we promote authority? I talked about this a little bit in our examination of the ACRL framework, ACC and scholarship as conversation, but I wanted to touch back to that. When we talk about authority, there's two different kinds of authority that I'm thinking of. Authority is power and authority is expertise. Both of these types of authority, I think, need to be challenged and acknowledged and recognized in this in the framework. I think a lot of times we default to expertise as librarians whenever we're working with students. but we can also talk about power. So what I did was pull a really article that was really important to me in my learning about anti-racist pedagogy and culturally relevant pedagogy. Everything that we've been talking about today is whose community has, I lost my train of thought, but it's Terra Yoso, community cultural wealth. She really broke down the idea of shifting focus away from white middle class culture as both authority as power and authority as expertise. She writes about how traditionally and historically communities of color have been seen as places full of cultural poverty. So really relying on a deficit model of education. And that these marginalized communities, these communities of color, don't necessarily have their own form of cultural capital. So I pulled out a graph that she created to talk a little bit about community cultural wealth. There's 6 aspects of community cultural wealth. I'll talk very briefly about them. Aspirational capital. When we think about aspirational capital, we think about ways in which these marginalized communities continue to dream, continue to progress, continue to find joy in the face of all the structural and systemic barriers that they face. Familial capital, moving away again from the white middle class norm, quote unquote norm, into one that focuses on, extended families, grandparents, church groups that might act as adult parental figures in a child's life, social services that might act as an adult parental figure. Very similar social capital, ways in which the society as a whole of these communities, of marginalized communities, kind of work together to promote their own social capital. So the example she gives is, if there's a Black student that's needs help writing a scholarship essay, they may not have the same social capital to go speak to a friend of, a parental friend that might be a professor at a university. So they work, within their own social group. Maybe they have a friend that wrote a scholarship essay. They might have a favorite teacher in the high school, things like that. So just developing a social capital separate from that white middle class way. Navigational, I think about that a lot. Again, I am very, I find, especially on a rural campus, as Jenelle said, a rural campus that's a very homogeneous community, but a very diverse campus. Understanding how students navigate our campuses is very important. So the navigational capital, how to seek help, how to move through, again, these structural barriers and systemic barriers that put into place, and how these students, break through those barriers. Linguistic capital, students that may have, additional language skills, which in the past, if a student spoke Spanish, if we're focusing on, white as the norm, that Spanish speaking will be seen as a problem. In community cultural wealth, it's an asset. And resistant capital, all these things all brought together to help resist, help to uplift voices, help resist the dominant culture, help uplift marginalized culture. So community cultural wealth is an array of knowledge, skills, abilities, and contexts possessed and utilized by communities of color to survive and resist macro and micro forms of aggression. Jenelle talked a little bit about criticality, so I'm going to go through these quickly. Criticality, as defined by Muhammad, is the aim is to detect or recognize misrepresentations or deceptiveness in language of the opponent or those who challenge truth. Criticality enables us to question both the world and texts within it to better understand the truth in history, power, and equity. Again, calling out misrepresentations. In doing so, criticality requires for teachers and students to understand the ideologies and perspectives of marginalized communities and their ways of knowing and experiencing the world. So you'll see that as the theme, the theme that ties all of this together is recognizing understanding, acknowledging, and uplifting these the voices of these marginalized communities. And it is an act of truth-telling. Finding truth will create an opportunity to listen and uplift the voices of the historically marginalized person. Therefore, a push for criticality is a push to investigate positions from different standpoints and lenses. And then tying it all together, it's really a very brief definition. I mean, we could do a whole nother presentation on critical pedagogy, but really a brief definition and ways to challenge authority is through critical pedagogy, through dialogue. Freire, kind of, again, the seminal work about critical pedagogy. The teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself taught in dialogue with the students, who in turn, while being taught, also teach. So again, uplifting of voices, removing the central authority in a classroom, and acknowledging that other people in the classroom have lived experiences that we can learn from. And tying all those together, the 4 or 5 aspects of historically responsive literacies that Jenelle mentioned a few slides ago, yeah, again, really serves to challenge authority and dismantles oppression. That's the main goal. So not just to talk about it, but to actually do and begin dismantling the oppressive structures.
And so with that, after the students, they come back with all their books and they're really excited to share. And I say, you can share as much or just a little bit as you're comfortable with sharing. But they have this idea that they're going to help one another, learn from one another. And so they bring back books that represent that critical perspective, that's humanizing, that's uplifting. And we talk about it. We say, who's the authority of who's the author and what's their authority? The author's portrayal of the diverse characters is who's benefiting from this text. Is there joy or is it trauma porn? Are they capitalizing off of the fact that these people have been marginalized for decades, centuries, and or is it uplifting? And that type of an amount of representation. Are they the main character? Are they the hero? Are they the antagonist? So I pull in my English, my reading, my history degrees, and I try to really talk with them about what are you going to use this for, and is this also, are there any voices missing? And if so, what are we going to do about it? Maybe this is a great book, but we're going to have to supplement something. And so I use Chains. It's not the perfect book. It's written about an enslaved young girl named Isabel, and it's written by a white author. However, when several years ago, when I had the chance to order all new novels for my class, I was really trying to find something for 7th grade that also gave historical background, and I wanted to go over so many things. My principal was extremely, extremely supportive of my research in this, and so I chose Chains, which is a novel that is based in, the setting is in the U.S. Revolutionary War, and it really gives us a different perspective of what usually is the dominant narrative. The white man who, is overthrowing the British throne, and so we have this discussion around who is silenced or marginalized when we talk about the American Revolutionary War, and what perspectives are missing. We talk about the enslaved African American, which Isabel, the main character, brings in. She's strong. She knows how to read. We talk about how that's extremely abnormal for the time. It was actually illegal. And so we talk about that power of hers, her resistance. We talk about the indigenous people who were removed from their lands, the proclamation, and why that made so many people angry when King George said, no, you can't go past the Appalachian region. And we also talk about, the book brings up the prison system, which you can go into a little bit of abolition idea, and prisoners of war and how they're treated. And if you've never done that dominant narrative, it can be scary at first. So I included a resource there, which will be shared here in a moment. And so just putting this into practice, I know it can be scary at first when you have all these ideas and you're just not sure how do you get it in, especially if you're a one-shot session. And if you're not as fortunate as I was to get that whole 2.5 hours, the first thing is just know your bias. And then engage in criticality while centering that beauty, the humanity, the truth, and joy. So when you're deciding your collection, make sure that you are looking at these types of things. Muhammad has an entire chapter on how to select, so I'll leave that to you. And then if financially you are able to do a diversity audit, but if not, for example, I start with sections at a time, and I really look for who's representing these views and who's missing, and I just go section by section, and I really try to use disrupting text and that novel mind database that I'll show you here on the next slide, I believe. Yes. So I just took a screenshot of this. It's amazing. When I am looking for something, for example, when I was a middle school librarian and I realized I did not have a lot on disability rights in a way that centers them and not trauma and really celebrates them. And so this is novel mind database. I can't say enough good things about it. It's amazing. And so when probably the one thing you're wondering is if I'm at a regional campus, if I haven't reached out to the education professors. So how do I discuss it? I, for one, had an older professor who I was very worried, but he was completely open when I said my approach is through culturally relevant pedagogy. I will be calling out oppression. I will be calling out the oppressor. And he was actually okay. Now, later on, I sent an email about white supremacist systems. Like he was like, I'm not forwarding this on to my students, basically. I just don't know. And so we actually had a really good conversation over the phone about that. And so you can find that while you'd really like to push, sometimes you have to ease your way into it as much as you would like to be radical, as I would like to be radical. And so putting this into action with students, I try to relate to the students. Who or what were you missing? So for example, I have cochlear implants. I wore hearing aids all through high school. And I always felt like the only person. I was the only one who I knew who could hardly hear anything. And I always felt like that idea was missing, or the representation of deaf people that I saw was extremely negative. And then I just continue with feedback and follow-up. I'm always in the library. The students come back for every little thing that they need. It's not just about selection of the book. They need help with printing. And so I really try to be open with them and let them know I'm there for them, no matter what they need. I don't think, so preparation, this is just a bonus that I'm going to give to you. I'm not going to go over this, but these are all the things that I give to the pre-service teachers to help them be responsible in knowing their background information, to know how to talk about race, to know how to talk about identities. And so you'll get these slides with all of that information. Learning for Justice is amazing. The Let's Talk publication goes over everything.